Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your host, Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast and the official podcast of the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music. Our topic today is the place of the Greek language in the Roman Rite, and as you might guess, we get into how and when it changed to Latin, as well as some aspects about the role of learning Latin in the spiritual lives of people today. My guest today is an adjunct faculty member of the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music and a longtime friend, Father Nicholas Schneider. Father Schneider holds a doctorate in sacred liturgy from San Anselmo in Rome, as well as an undergraduate degree in music. Last summer, he taught our excellent History of the Roman Rite course at the CISM, and Father has many gifts, as you'll hear in this interview. He currently derives tremendous joy from his daily apostolic work, teaching as a Montessori guide at Christ the King School in Mandan, North Dakota. Before we get to the episode, I'm excited to announce our summer 2024 term at the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music. We're offering 9 classes from 6 faculty members, again this summer with free tuition. If you're interested in the topic of our episode today, I'd particularly recommend to you our History and Principles of Sacred Music class, which is an online course starting May 27th for 9 weeks at your own pace, followed by 2 days with live online instruction. More information about the course is available at our website. Courses will fill up fast, so don't wait to apply. Visit our website at catholicinstituteofsacredmusic.org and click on Summer Courses. And now, on to the interview. Father, it's great to have you on the show. I'm so happy that you were able, at the end of a long school day, to join me and talk about probably something that you did not talk about today in class with your little kids.
No, I did not talk about the language of the ancient languages of the Roman Rite with beautiful 9 to 12-year-old children.
So, a central component of Christian sacred music is, of course, the text. Christ, the Word of God, the Logos, expresses the Father. So Christian music participates in that in a way, and it's modeled on the Savior. It expresses truth. It makes connections between the mind of the hearer and reality. And of course, the music itself does this, even aside from the text, with its own musical language and grammar. But the specificity of ideas made possible through words is central to the Christian understanding of what sacred music is and does. And I would say even, just the intelligibility of reality and how God made us. But beyond this, the text is a vital link to the tradition. And here I'm thinking not just of scripture, but also other texts handed on through tradition, which God employs in his economy of salvation throughout history. So you are a musician, but your advanced degrees are actually in liturgy. So I'm wondering if you could offer your unique perspective and speak a little bit from a theological perspective about the role of language in the liturgy. How do words participate in God's work in the sacred liturgy?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that the Christian faith is a proclaimed faith. It's a revealed faith, which means that, it's not something that human beings can figure out on their own. And so God had to reveal himself, and he had to reveal himself using human language. And so divine revelation even reveals that the second person of the Trinity takes the name, the Word, the eternal Word. So, there's this marvelous interplay between the fact that we have to even St. Paul says, that we come to faith through hearing. And so that's why it has to be proclaimed. So the words are proclaimed, but what we're proclaiming is itself this eternal word. And so there's this entire theology around, what we say matters, and we have to say things accurately and truly as they've been revealed to us. And, if we think then about the liturgy as the central act of the Christian life, it's within the liturgy that proclamation becomes heightened and elevated. And so, all of these pieces, the sacred action, the revelation of the word in word, all fit together, I think, from a theological perspective.
Right. And you and I think, a lot of our listeners coming to this as musicians realize that words aren't the only way that we convey meaning, but they do still, nevertheless, play a privileged role in the Christian religion.
Absolutely. It's interesting. One of the things that I think is important to reflect on when it comes to the use of language in the Christian life in general, but also in the sacred liturgy and in sacred music, is that words and language don't just communicate. If we think of language in terms of a form of communication, the most important thing is the accuracy of the language, which obviously we want accurate, true language. But language has also been used as far back as we have written language as a form of expression as well. And there's a difference between language that's used for expression and language that's used for communication. The first criteria of language that communicates is that it's clear and accurate. But language that's expressive is something that stirs up the heart, that elevates, that it's language that pours out something that's coming from within more than just accurately communicating ideas. And the language of Christian revelation, yes, is accurate and true, but it also has the expressive quality. You could take any of Shakespeare's sonnets, and anyone, hopefully your listeners are the kinds of folks sometimes who pull out a beautiful piece of poetry. You could say what Shakespeare says in 15 lines, 16 lines in a sonnet in 2 sentences, but it's not as expressive.
That's a really helpful distinction. We can also approach this question of language and the centrality of language in the liturgy from the perspective of sacramental theology. And one of the things I sometimes think about a lot and discuss with my students is, it's not always helpful to use the terminology and concepts in sacramental theology as if they were the only things to discuss the sacred liturgy. But there are some helpful things. And particularly when it comes to language, is it, for example, possible to have a liturgy that is carried out, i.e. confecting the sacrament, in a movement of the heart only and does not use words? Is that actually possible?
That's a quick, dirty answer is no. you have to have, the Augustine's way of describing this is that a word descends upon a sacred action and it becomes a sacrament. And so you need both elements coming together. Certainly from the standpoint of the sacramental life, there might be elements of a sacred rite that don't have language. There are moments where there's a procession or a sacred action or something that doesn't have language to it. But a sacramental rite, certainly not, and an entire liturgy certainly isn't possible without the use of words.
Right. So there's an expression, to use what you were defining or distinguishing earlier, in the physical body itself, the physical action that matters, but it's has a particular unity with that word. So I mean, you have a sort of language of material reality through actions as well, and so therefore it's even doubly less possible for you to just think in your mind and do nothing with your body and confect the sacrament as a priest, right? Like it's impossible.
Yeah, it's really true. I think about this really often, even in the spiritual life. Like if you read a lot of the great spiritual authors, or I think especially like of St. Dominic, he's got this whole set of postures of prayer. And for him, it's like the body really, really matters for prayer. You don't just go and sit by yourself in silence and commune with God. And there is certainly in the Christian tradition a place for, silent interior prayer, because the interior life is what kind of drives everything. But at the same time, like the body and the voice really do have to come together too.
Can we talk about the early roots of the Roman Rite? What languages were employed in the earliest liturgies in Rome?
Yes. As far as we can tell, the language of the Roman Rite in its, I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole with this, because this could become like a 3-hour conversation. Because, but at what point do we want to say that there's such a thing as a Roman Rite? And this is a question that could be debated to some degree. At which point in the development of the liturgy of Rome do you have enough of the constitutive Roman elements to say this is the Roman rite. But from the earliest time that we have available, the liturgy was celebrated in Rome in the Greek language.
And what would you say? I mean, okay, if we go back to Christians in Jerusalem, what was happening simultaneously there?
Oh, my goodness. So we actually have some really interesting archaeological discoveries, not only in Jerusalem, but all of that kind of like border territory of the Roman Empire. Like there's this place in Dura Europa. I don't know if you've heard about this, but they found one of these churches. You know, if you've ever heard of the house churches, they found one there. It was right on the border of the Jewish quarter. It was like one of these garrison towns on the outlying areas, the eastern outlying areas of the Roman Empire. It has all the characteristics of a church, but it was a house that had been converted into a church. So, you know, there's the dining room, the triclinium had been converted into the body of the church, you know, where the Eucharistic sacrifice took place. And then the bath had been converted into a baptistry. And then there was another room. They're not absolutely certain what took place in it, but they think it was sort of like a catechumenate or an instruction hall. They also found some little scraps of liturgical texts on scrolls, and they were written in Hebrew.
Wow.
And so there's major questions, you know, was that because in that part of the world there was still a memory? And this goes back like 3rd century. So we're down the road a ways, from the founding of our faith. But there's some big questions, you know, were they in Hebrew because that's preserving the local tradition where the liturgy was celebrated in Hebrew? Were these, because it's so close to the Jewish quarter, were these Jewish converts who had their church? But certainly Hebrew and Aramaic were in use there. Syriac in other places was a language that was used in the East. A large portion of the Christian church, though, in these early centuries was Greek speaking.
Great. So let's tackle a little bit, perhaps of a thorny question and something that is a common argument that comes up. And that is the relationship between these early languages and the vernacular spoken in everyday life. You know, is it just the street Greek? Is it, we'll get to Latin in a moment, but what's the relationship between vernacular and hieratic sacred language?
You know, if any of your listeners are interested in reading the good stuff on this topic, there was a professor, her name is Dr. Christine Mormon, and she wrote extensively on the ancient Christian languages and especially ancient, early Christian Latin. And she's very clear that the language that was used in sacred worship was not the vernacular language. Now, that isn't to say that someone, hearing it wouldn't have picked up and understood, what was being used, but it was not the language of the street, any more than, I've been trying to find an analog that might make sense, but something like the English of the Book of Common Prayer, like that higher level of English that's definitely not the language of the street, accessible with difficulty, I think would be the characteristics of, that kind of hieratic language.
So actually, this prompts another question. Why is that? Why is there a necessity for somehow a stylization that feels like a removal from the daily life built in from the very beginning of every liturgical worship?
I think it's universal to all types of worship, not just Christian worship. I think it's an anthropological principle that when human beings come before the Almighty, that they have the sense that it needs to be elevated.
Right. There's something happening here that transcends the everyday life, even though God is immediately present more than we can even realize to the everyday life.
Absolutely.
Could you explain to our listeners what they might hear as the Greek remnants in the Roman Rite today?
We don't have many, in terms of the actual Greek words that are there. We have the Kyrie eleison, and then during Holy Week, like on Good Friday, you have the reproaches with the Trisagion, embedded in that. Other than that, we don't get a lot of Greek words themselves in the Roman Rite. And, there's also a tradition of for some of the higher feasts of proclaiming the gospel at the papal mass in St. Peter's Basilica, which most of us aren't going to hear.
So let's now talk about the shift to Latin. What prompted the shift to Latin in the Roman Rite, and when did that happen?
I think in order to talk about the shift to Roman and Latin, it might be helpful just to lay a little bit of the background for why the liturgy remained in Greek for so long. Because it wasn't until the late 4th century that the liturgy was translated into Latin from the Greek. And so in the earliest time of Christian worship in Rome, most of the Christians who were in Rome were Greek speaking. And the main reason for that is that Greek was the language of international commerce. It was a language of trade. It's interesting, it was also, for the intellectual elite, a language of the high arts. So you had two forms of Greek that were going around. One was the language of the philosophers and playwrights of Greece, of the intellectual elite who actually couldn't speak Greek. They could read it and they could study them, but they wouldn't have learned it. And then the other was, kind of this language of the downtrodden masses who were being shuffled around the empire, in and out of the ports. And, so it was the language of the shipsmen, of the poor, the work, the working class poor, And so it was also the language of the Jews of the diaspora, among whom were a fair number of the early Christian converts. And so that was the language, of Christian interaction. It was also the language of the scriptures, at least of the New Testament, and they would have had, it would have been fairly common to use the Septuagint as well for those in the diaspora. So because of that, Greek was pretty common. Now, it was very common for Christian worship, but it was, if you're a Roman citizen in the 2nd century, there were a lot of foreign sects coming in that were Greek speaking. And so for a Roman citizen who wasn't a person of faith, Christianity would have looked just like any of the other Eastern, Oriental type religions that were coming in. They spoke Greek, and so people were fine with that. It was a normal thing for a wide variety of foreign religions coming into the city that had Greek-speaking roots. And then as Christianity got more of a foothold and there were more converts to Christianity and things began to develop, they maintained Greek even as there were more even more native Latin speakers as converts. And there were a number of reasons for that. One is that by that point, the Greek language had developed quite a bit. The Greek Christian language had developed quite a bit, become quite sophisticated. It had all the vocabulary necessary for theology to communicate the truth of the faith. That's one. Another is that Romans were perfectly fine having even, this is interesting, even the Latin of pagan worship by that time was so ancient that it was unintelligible. I mean, we have inscriptions of Latin language prayers of the pagan cults that are almost unintelligible. So they're like, well, what does it matter? We don't have to know what the words are, and we can go ahead and keep on having this. And the other reason is that Christian Latin had not developed, in large part because the Greek language was there. And so because of that, you have a Latin that doesn't yet have all the characteristics necessary to have a hieratic language. And the bits and pieces of Latin that do exist are from pagan worship, which is also the people who were just martyring you or maybe presently martyring you. So there's going to be a resistance to taking in the language of someone who might put you to death.
Yeah.
So it took quite a while. So the first thing that had to happen was a bit of a development of some Christian Latin. And, the first ones would be, like Tertullian, who makes some attempts at Christian Latin. It was a very different language than what we eventually, even the vocabulary of Tertullian, if you read him, he tries to coin new terminology, fancy, $2 word, neologism, a new word. He tried to coin a lot of new language. So instead of just transliterating baptizo for baptize, he used the word contingo, which means to dip, So he tried to create new words. They never stuck. Then you didn't yet have a translation of the scriptures that was adequate for the sacred liturgy. So that whole process had to go through. So the end of the persecutions had to happen. The scriptures had to get translated, and there had to be enough of a consensus around the theological language in order to feel confident and comfortable putting the Mass into Latin.
Right. So do you think that it happened in stages? That, for example, the canon was initially translated and then other parts of the ordinary and then the propers? What does the evidence show that process looked like?
It's a little bit difficult because by the time we really get something that puts all the pieces together, that whole process had taken place. But we have some clues. So in the 380s, there are a couple of authors who are commenting on the Roman canon. And in the early part of the decade, they quote it in Greek. And in the latter part of the decade, they quote it in Latin.
Interesting.
And what's really, really interesting is that the quotations from Latin are clearly the same lines, but the language is different enough that it's not just a translation, meaning that the author didn't just go and say, I'm going to put this in Latin so that my readers can understand it. He's quoting the liturgical text. And part of that is that there's a bit of the poetry of the liturgical text with the rhythmic cadences that come at the end of of each of the phrases. So that's interesting. So we know that the Roman canon's happening then. We also know that Pope Damis I had this intense interest in Christianizing the Latin culture, the Roman culture. And one of the ways that he wanted to do that was through the language. He's the one who commissioned the translation of the Vulgate, or however you want to call it, the updating of the language of the old Italic versions, however you want to think about the work that Jerome did.
Just to answer the question here, what years are we talking about with Pope Damis first?
Pope Damis, he will say 366 to 383.
So sorry, you were talking about Jerome, translation, etc.
So we know that the Roman canon was being put into Latin around that time. It's interesting that in St. Ambrose, we also have a version of what looks an awful lot like the Roman canon. You can, your listeners who are really interested and like to get into the weeds can, compare the text from St. Ambrose to the final text. But, by 400, we have essentially the Roman canon. There'll be a few tweaks. It finally gets completed in 604 or just before 604 with Pope St. Gregory the Great. So, in that period, there are a few additions, a few tweaks. It also winds up getting that gorgeous double helix structure that it has. So there's certainly some developments that happen, but the language is getting pretty close here in that first layer. Other little bits of evidence that we have that the Latin language of the Roman Rite is kind of coming from this time is that we have a number of the propers that are in a Latin that is not the same as the Vulgate, which means that those who were singing them and the time when the earliest layers of the melodies were developed were likely pre-Vulgate, if we're preserving the language in order to match in some ways the melodies. And of course, you can get into the scholarly debate about how those melodies changed and developed over the time. But at any rate, the texts were preserved.
Yeah. Well, there's also the element of the sort of libretto crafting of the Latin for the propers, which is an additional thing. You know, it's partially that it's a non-Vulgate source for the text, and that, you know, regardless of the source, that composers did feel free to insert words, or, you know, for example, Dici Dominus, how prevalent is that, and or, you know, other sorts of phrases that crafted into that liturgical chant. So can you now speak a little bit about the relationship of the Latin at the time of that shift to the speaking and understanding of the Christians at that time? Is there still the same, you know, vernacular versus hieratic divide that we're talking about? I mean, even aside from all the issues that you already raised about having theological specificity and whatnot.
So if we think about the comparison between the spoken style of the streets and the language of the liturgy, we use this term hieratic fairly frequently. And, you know, we can ask the question, what does that mean? And how, you know, what do we mean by hieratic? It certainly means a sacred language, but again, what do we mean by that? And there's a few qualities that a hieratic language typically has. One is the preservation of vocabulary that is a bit antiquated, because it gives a sense of coming from a past time. Another is that there are typically some elements of poetic features to the language. It doesn't necessarily mean that everything is written as a poem, but it has poetic elements. You know, one of the elements that comes into the Latin language of the Roman Rite is some elements that are related to Hebrew poetry, which means parallelism. So you say the same thing, but in different words. So de tuis donis ac datis, you know, your gifts and your gifts, really, you know, but it has that sense of repetition to it. This is not the way the people of the street speak, you know. Another is that one of the features of Roman poetry is alliteration, and if you listen really carefully to the language of the Latin language of the Roman Rite, there's quite a lot of alliteration. Even that phrase is a citation of Chronicles, but it's reworked for the liturgy to have that sense of alliteration, of parallelism, and then. It gets a little bit into the weeds of language here, but it tends to replace simple constructions with more complex constructions. And in the Latin of the Roman Rite, the two ways that happens mostly is by replacing direct statements with relative clauses or with ablative absolutes. You know, and if you want more linguistic explanation, if that's helpful for your readers, I can maybe.
Yeah, I mean, maybe could you give some examples? I mean, the examples that come to mind when you say that to me are the things in the Collex, for example.
Oh yeah, the Collex are filled with all those things. So if you think about the structure of the Collex, they typically have an invocation of God and then a relative clause that gives some feature of God. You know, oh God, you who deigned to do this thing. You know, that's not how we speak in our everyday life. You know, all this piling up of relative clauses. You know, an example from the Quam Oblationem is Quam Oblationem tu Deus in omnibus quesumus benedictam facere digneris. So there's a relative clause in there. You know, which oblation you, O God. Like, we just don't speak in that way in our day-to-day life. And then again in the Qui Pridie, there's another really good example. Qui Pridie quam pateretur accepit panem in sanctus et venerabile manus suas. And then there's an ablative absolute, elevatis oculis in caelum, his eyes raised to heaven. You know, that elevatis oculis is an ablative absolute construction. We don't speak that way in daily life, and neither did the Romans.
Yeah. Well, it has a sort of narrative quality about it, right? Like maybe in everyday life, the place you might experience that is in reading a novel almost, you know?
Mm.
So, okay. So Why do you think it's worth some effort on the part of today's Roman Rite Christians to learn Latin? And I'm thinking of this specifically in light of the current situation, which is that thanks to ISIL, we have some pretty good translations of things. Are there spiritual benefits, do you think, to learning some elements of Latin?
Well, yeah. I mean, there's certainly natural benefits. The literature on intellectual growth, on the learning of any of the classical languages is pretty clear. So there's certainly natural benefits. Spiritual benefits, I think there's plenty of them. First of all, so I have a really good friend who once pointed out that when you go into a church or a chapel, and a lot of people pray there often. Maybe there's an adoration chapel at a church and it's well frequented, the sacrament's exposed and people are in and out, and there's just lots of prayer happening there. There's a feeling in that place of the collective sense of that prayer in that place. And when you enter, it's just easier to enter into prayer because there's an aura of prayer in that place. I think a lot of people experience that, who have traveled to Assisi. They just feel like this is a place that's been prayed in, and you can feel it even in the whole town, a place of peace. And the Latin language has been prayed in longer by more people than any other language of Christians. The Greek language was pretty common in the first century, but, the Roman Catholic Church has for some time been the largest of the Christian churches, and it's been prayed in longer than any other language. So you can get a sense, if you take some time to get to know the Latin and get to know the language, of being surrounded by that, of entering into that. And the other thing, from my own experiences, and my Latin's pretty good, and I, can read it pretty fluently, but I still have to be on my toes. So I can't just, with English, there's a sense of, I know what the words mean, and it's a little bit easier to kind of check out, so to speak, when reading it. You can't do that in Latin. You have to stay focused because it's a different language. Not just different in the way that any other modern language is different, but the classical languages are different in that the syntax of most of the modern languages, even though there's some oddities, the sentence construction in German is a little bit different. And, the placement of adjectives and things like that can be different in some of the Romance languages. But for the most part, the syntax of all of them is pretty similar. The syntax of the ancient languages is all over the place, and you really have to be on your toes for catching it.
Yeah. It raises the question of accessibility versus things that are stylized in general, I think, in terms of the liturgy. I think of this one time I was asked to give a talk about Gregorian chant to 8th graders at a confirmation retreat. I said, challenge accepted, and I went in there and I asked the students, how many of you understand absolutely everything that happens at Mass? And like 2 goody 2-shoes raised their hand. I said, wow, you are more learned and smart and intelligent and wise than all, all the fathers of the church, because to think that we know everything which is going on is not an accurate understanding of how God works in our lives, that he allows us to, yes, absolutely connect with reality and understand things. He is intelligible, but there is something that goes always beyond our capacity as human beings, and things which emphasize accessibility without the stylization of things that are less accessible sometimes lull us into a sort of spiritual sleep of thinking that we really understand everything. Not all we end up doing is putting God in a human brain-sized box.
Yeah, and a lot of people have commented on how the idea that we could do that is really an Enlightenment idea, that the Enlightenment philosophy was looking for clear and distinct ideas. The beginning of it all with Descartes, I think, therefore I am. Here's a clear, distinct idea from which we can construct a system. And then, if we apply the idea of clear and distinct ideas to the Christian faith, which, like you say, is intelligible, of course, because God is intelligence itself, but to think that everything about God can be summarized in a clear and distinct idea, really, not only lulls us into a spiritual sleep, but I think gives us a false sense of of who we are before God.
Right. What are some things that you would encourage the average Catholic to do to learn some Latin?
Simple things. One is to, you could learn any of your regular Catholic prayers in Latin. It's a good place to start. Dr. McInerney, he was one of these great Thomists and taught for years and years. His son is it DQ is really popular these days. He's written a number of books, but his dad, Ralph, wrote a little book called Let's Read Latin. And he takes a number of the important Psalms. He takes the Hymn of Our Lady, the Magnificat. He also takes the Benedictus, and he puts them in Latin, and then he goes line by line parsing them with their grammar, which is kind of a nice introduction to Latin grammar without having to get too into the weeds with it. It can be nice from time to time to pray the Psalms in Latin because the language is a little bit more familiar since we're used to hearing them.
The vocabulary is not as large.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, it's a really limited vocabulary. I know that there's a lot of organizations out there right now that are dedicated to preserving and teaching Latin, anywhere from intensive courses where you can go and live on site in places for 8 weeks and be surrounded by people speaking Latin, to, audio productions. I think there's places that are starting, I think there's a place in Sweden that's putting the news in Latin.
Oh, really?
So there's there's all kinds of little things out there to hear it. It's good to listen to things where you can hear it. It's helpful to remember that it is, in some ways, a living language, even though it's not, a living language in the same sense that it belongs to a nation, that speaks it on the daily. But you're not going to go to a place, aside from some specific instances, and be immersed. But you still want to hear it. You want to hear it spoken. You want to hear it pronounced. And then, if someone goes past learning a few of their basic prayers, maybe praying the Psalms a bit, and wants to go further, then you got to get a good Latin grammar and dig into the meat and potatoes to really get there.
Yeah. And of course, any musician knows that when you sing things, it's easier to remember the words and the progression of syllables, even if it feels far yet from your complete understanding. Well, thank you so much, Father. It's been a pleasure to have you on, and I'll look forward to seeing you again soon.
Likewise. Thanks.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is from the Prelude and Fugue in G Major, BWV 550 by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.